Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and you're very correct that we have worked together on many of the specifics that we're going to be considering today so that we can address this ID theft issue and the question of taxpayer protection. Every new headline about hackers and crooks and scamsters stealing taxpayer dollars and personal data is a reminder that there is much more work to be done to protect the hardworking taxpayers of the country. There's the recent example of the hack into the Get Transcript system at the IRS. Here, the crooks nailed taxpayers coming and going. Lax security on the IRS system left the front door open to hackers who stole data on 750,000 taxpayers. Then, when the IRS gave out special identity protection PIN numbers to the victims, the IRS opened the back door by again using a security system that didn't keep the bad guys out. That's why this package, and there was bipartisan support for this, streamlined critical pay authority, which the IRS can use to build a top-notch team of tech experts to beat back the hackers, protect taxpayer data, and finally, colleagues, get out in front of the crooks. And it's going to be much easier to flag and crack down on fraudulent returns by making better use of the national database of new hires. These are strong, bipartisan steps that I push to include in this legislation. But colleagues, I just want to spend a couple of minutes here in wrapping up by way of saying that with this good work that's been done, there remains a glaring loophole in this package as it stands now, and my view is politics have gotten in the way of fixing it. If this legislation, when it hits the floor, doesn't allow for minimum basic standards to crack down on crooked, fraudulent, and incompetent return preparers, it will be one more example of lawmakers in Congress willfully failing to protect vulnerable taxpayers. The victims of fraud and incompetence are not just Democrats, Republicans, or independents, and they aren't exclusive to blue states or red states. The fact is, this is an issue that has absolutely nothing, zero, to do with politics. It does have everything to do with the Americans we represent who are getting ripped off by criminals and Congress sitting on its hands instead of acting to stop it. Right now, there are no minimum national standards whatsoever for paid tax return preparers. Absolutely no rules, colleagues, to prevent incompetence. No safeguards to keep con artists from falsifying returns and leaving their victims in financial ruin. Colleagues, it just doesn't pass the smell test to say everything's okay with a system that has taxpayers handing over their Social Security and bank account numbers to people who meet no standards whatsoever. There are nearly 500,000 registered preparers who don't claim to have professional credentials. And last year alone, these paid tax preparers submitted more than 75 million returns, well more than half of all returns filed with the IRS. Study after study has found high rates of errors in tax returns filed by paid preparers who are not required to meet minimum basic standards of competency. By comparison, preparers in Oregon and the handful of other states with minimum standards have lower rates than paid preparers nationally. Even unpaid volunteers required to meet minimum standards outperform paid tax preparers. One prominent national chain of preparers has been forced to close dozens of locations across the country because of rampant fraud committed by franchisees and their workers. The Maryland comptroller was recently forced to stop accepting returns from 65 questionable tax prep firms at 68 locations in the state. One California man who ran a string of tax prep businesses ripped off taxpayers to the tune of $14 million before he was banned from the industry by a federal court. Just in the last few weeks, indictments have been handed down to accused fraudsters in New Mexico, Texas, Maryland, Rhode Island, New York, Alabama, and elsewhere. And I think, colleagues, it's particularly noteworthy that these indictments stem from crimes committed 3, 4, and 5 years ago in several cases. That's how long it takes to bring criminals to justice in this shadowy environment. Those are just a handful of the cases that have been uncovered. What to me ought to scare us most is that there's no good way of figuring out just how much money the criminals are actually pocketing. There's no way to tell exactly how many Americans have been victimized or to keep the bad guys out from the beginning. The bottom line is the Congress has left the door open, and the fraudsters and the rip-off artists and the organized criminals have invaded. Their victims are often some of the most vulnerable people in the country, working families who struggle to make ends meet and turn to paid preparers every single spring. Meanwhile, tax lawyers and accountants who typically work with wealthier Americans and business owners go through years of schooling and rigorous certification. They don't operate in the shadows the way criminal paid preparers do because there are strong rules that protect their clients. So when it comes to getting tax help, colleagues, the well-off are fine. They're safe. The less fortunate end up getting thrown to the wolves. In my judgment, the fact that Congress is maintaining this imbalance is simply unfair to millions of Americans. It would be like the Congress telling construction companies that on the less affluent side of town, they don't have to build houses to code or use licensed contractors. The standards ought to be there, basic, minimum standards. They ought to be there to protect everybody. And I finally want to wrap up by saying setting minimum standards for the preparers is not some wacky, brand new idea that came from the far left. A small handful of states have rules in place, including my home state of Oregon. And most importantly, under Democratic and Republican leadership in the past, the recent past, this committee supported legislation giving the green light for minimum standards. Unfortunately, for unrelated reasons, those efforts never got a bill to the president's desk. In September, the Finance Committee had a bill ready to go that combined these vital minimum standards with many of the same additional proposals that are now up for consideration. The markup was pulled at the 11th hour. 8 months later, the provision on minimum standards for preparers is now absent. There are 2 bills before the committee now. Part of the second bill writes into permanent law the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. It's called VITA, which helps low-income folks file their taxes. To protect these taxpayers near the bottom of the income scale, this program requires testing and minimum standards for its volunteers. My guess is the committee is going to vote to make that requirement permanent. So what we're talking about now is basically formalizing a double standard. I can see absolutely no reason why minimum protective standards are good enough for a modest program like VITA, but they don't make the cut for paid preparers used by millions around the country. So I'm going to offer an amendment when we get to that point in the discussion that would end this double standard and allow for minimum standards for preparers. This amendment is going to be different from proposals we've looked at in the past. For example, a number of my colleagues have said, and I've appreciated the conversations that we've had, a number of colleagues have said they oppose setting minimum standards because of the IRS's role in overseeing the process. So in this amendment, colleagues, I've chosen to leave the IRS out of the equation. The Treasury Department handles setting up the standards and making sure that they are in place. In fact, this amendment goes so far as to move the office that handles these issues, colleagues, out of the IRS completely. After the last markup was canceled, we went to great lengths to address all the concerns that members heard from outside groups, including the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. They all, in my view, had a number of things to say that were legitimate. So we went to work to address those concerns, and I think colleagues got their letter last night saying that they now support this amendment so we would have minimum standards. Finally, 2 days ago was tax day. And I'm sure right across the country now, they're desperate people who are victimized by these scamsters trying to figure out how to clean up the damage. I would hope we would set aside now, and I've tried to do this in my opening statement, let's set aside our opinions about the administration and politics. This committee has the ability this morning to take steps to protect people from financial ruin on a bipartisan basis, really a non-partisan basis. So I hope my colleagues will support it. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the work that we've done. There are many other features of this bill that I think are very sensible, and I appreciate the chance to talk about one that, regrettably, I think is a big omission.